Hello, welcome everyone to another Risk Minds webinar, delivering expert insights on risk management. I'm Ed Stapley, Editor-in-Chief of Risk Minds, and I'd like to welcome today Steve Lindo, course designer and instructor in enterprise risk management at Columbia University, and Dr. Jay Grusin, former member of the CIA's Senior Intelligence Service and CIA University Certified SAT instructor. And Jay also is doing some work in the private sector as well since he retired. So today Steve and Jay will be discussing how to apply intelligent risk management techniques to the financial sector. We'll be live tweeting this webinar, so you can join in the conversation using the hashtag RiskMindsLive. Please do remain until the end of the broadcast as well, because we'll be sharing an exclusive gift with the audience of this webinar. So if you've got any questions during the presentation, you can send them over to us using the Ask a Question tab that will be on your screen. Any questions that pop into your head at all, do submit those on there, and I will be asking those at the end of the webinar. So that's all from me. Over to Jay and Steve for their talk.
Hello everybody, this is Steve Lindo, and we're very glad that we've got this chance to give you some information about some work that Jay and I are collaborating on, bridging the two sides of the universe between government work and the private sector. So let me tell you a little bit about what we have for you today. We're going to break essentially our presentation into three parts, and I'm going to start off by comparing some traditional risk analysis practices that you're familiar with in the financial sector with some that are used in the intelligence sector. And then after I've shown you that comparison with some details, then I'm going to hand over to Jay, and he's going to walk you through how to use one of the intelligence risk management techniques that he's practiced and taught during his 29 years with the CIA. So he'll really give you some details about that, how that works. And then when we've completed those two presentations, then, as Ed mentioned, we're going to open up the portion of this webinar for some questions from you. So hopefully you'll have some questions for us, because we definitely want to be able to answer them, and you can show us your interest in that way. So I'm going to move on now to the first of the topics that I'm going to cover. And so what I want to do is really relate these types of techniques to a world that you're familiar with, which is situations in which you're using traditional risk analysis approaches. And in a very simplistic or high-level way, basically every situation that needs risk analysis, whether it's large or small, it obviously has its unique characteristics, but typically one or a combination of these three types of approaches are going to be what you use in order to be able to both understand the risks and then put them into some orderly fashion that they can be communicated to the people that you work with. So the first one, quantitative analysis of empirical data, that's something I imagine many of you are working with all day and every day. And, you know, as just a small example of that would be, for example, the lifetime credit loss modeling under IFRS 9. This is something which many of you, I imagine, are up to your eyes in. It's all about the quantitative analysis of data that is completely unfiltered. It's coming from historical records and so on. It's completely objective. So that's an area that clearly occupies a lot of your work, but it doesn't cover the whole spectrum of situations. So there's another entire portion of that spectrum where you're essentially dealing with quantitative analysis, but it's not empirical data that you're using. It's data that's been generated by some kind of expert source. So it could be models that have been designed and calibrated that transform empirical data into model outputs. And so that's also a very large part of the work that's done in the financial sector. It could be, for example, when you're dealing with bank stress testing. Now, obviously, the underlying financial information the bank has is data, but it's transformed into forecasts using the models of many different kinds that then have to be sewn together. And those models are created by and calibrated by experts. And so that kind of quantitative analysis is using some expert-generated input. Now, when you've got both of those available, sometimes that's enough. But in the end, and situations typically don't give you all of the data that you need. And so ultimately, the default approach when you don't have data, or the data is scarce, or it's too heterogeneous, or it's unreliable, you have to eventually you have to apply expert judgment, which of course means something that you have. Those of you that have years of experience in risk management, that's when your talents and your skill come to the fore, because you still need to analyze the risks, but if you don't have the data, then your judgment is going to be the source. So with that universe, basically, these three approaches, sometimes they work well, of course, and in the majority of cases, but what happens when they don't? And typically, the kinds of situations that we're going to talk about today are ones where you have very high stakes involved, and you have these four problems that you have to overcome. You can have a huge deluge of information of various different kinds. It can be some structured, some unstructured. Basically, it can be very difficult to assemble and treat in a consistent manner. Not only that, but even though you're struggling to be able to organize the data and to get it into a communicable fashion, you also have to deal with some managerial and cultural issues amongst your colleagues that are working on any particular risk analysis, in particular cognitive biases of all kinds. I don't need to go through all of the different versions of cognitive bias. We all suffer from them, and in business situations, they are very prevalent. So I think you all know that cognitive biases can give incorrect or unreasonable weightings to all kinds of information that ultimately can influence the decision. On top of that, not just the cognitive biases, but also organizational biases. You're dealing with individuals, some of whom have more authority than others. And so on top of all of that, you mix into this cocktail the fact that a decision needs to be made based on the information that's being collated for analytical purposes under intense time pressure. So what types of situations give a good example of this? Well, it could be if your company is looking to make an acquisition or launch a new product, if you're expanding geographically, maybe dealing with a competitive threat, or even something more problematic like regulatory sanctions or a cyber attack, internal fraud. These are situations that are very complex and where you may not easily be able to use the three methods that I talked about, but there's a lot of reputation risk and a lot at stake. So these kinds of situations are ones where the three traditional approaches have not necessarily served people well, and I don't have to reiterate the long litany of cases where financial institutions have made bad decisions, and in part that's not because of their lack of decision-making power. It's because the analytical process that was used was very flawed because of these factors that I mentioned here. So before I move on to talk a little bit about the intelligence techniques, I'm going to ask you to tell me, just as best you can, give you maybe 20 or 30 seconds to answer this quick poll question and tell me what it is that you're seeing about these types of situations in your universe. So if you could open up the poll, Charlie, that would be great. And while you're trying to decide what to do, and obviously your answers are anonymous, so you can say exactly what you think, and we're just going to look at the composite result of this poll, which will tell us a little bit about you, the audience, where you are on the spectrum of either are you very confident in the ability of your organization to deal with these complex risk analysis situations or not. That's the purpose of these four questions, is to tell us what it is that you're seeing. So I don't know, Charlie, okay, and I'm seeing, what I'm seeing here is good. We'll just give you a couple more seconds here. We don't want to take up too much time on this webinar with looking at the poll, but what I can see here, and I'm going to just speak from my own experience, that looks a pretty good spectrum. In other words, there's a small percentage of people who work in organizations that have very good and effective processes in these complex situations, and there is a small percentage where the approach is seriously ineffective. But the majority of companies, and this is what, over 50% of you responding, you know that you could do better. And so what Jay and I are going to talk about in the time remaining is ways that you can do better, and using these techniques that have been long established in the intelligence sector. Great, so thank you. I'm going to move on now to talk about what we are, how we describe the techniques that Jay has been practicing and are prevalent in the government sector. So when we talk about intelligence risk, really, I'm taking a cue from the practice of intelligence risk analysis in the government sector. And that's something which has been very tremendously developed over the years. But intelligence risk really is essentially the failure to be able to properly approach the risk analysis in these complex situations. So as I mentioned before, the challenges are going to be this information overload, data which doesn't conclusively say one thing or another, the biases, the influence, the time pressure. And the risk is that as a result of these challenges, that an extremely important and high-impact decision can be made in a very short-sighted or imprudent manner, and it can have catastrophic consequences for companies. Now, I'm not saying that this is, let's say, prevalent anywhere, but one of the reasons why the intelligence sector has been more successful about developing techniques for this is because in the financial sector world, what happens is that these types of situations don't occur every day. They're intermittent, and when they do happen, typically there's a more or less an ad hoc approach. Gather all the team in question, get them in a room, get everybody to bring their data, and then say, okay, we've got 2 hours, we have to figure out what to do, and we need a decision by the end of it. So that is a poor climate for the kind of rigor and discipline that's needed to make sense of all of this massive amount of data and potentially distracting influences. Now, conversely, in the government sector, the agencies are dealing with this kind of situation every day. And as a result, they've got high stakes, they've got people and lives and political influence on the line. And so by virtue of continuous practice, the government agencies have developed field-tested and refined the kind of rigorous and repeatable analytical processes that are suitable for these kinds of situations. So, broadly speaking, these techniques fall into 3 categories, and I'm just really going to describe them generically. The first category, the diagnostic version, this is which tests established theories and the assumptions as to whether or not they're sound, whether there's corroborating evidence and objectivity. So it's a testing method. Then the contrarian techniques essentially challenge conventional beliefs and use techniques like what if and low probability to do that. And then in the third category, these are the imagination techniques, and they encourage brainstorming and disruptive ideas, something which you may be familiar with, but perhaps not so often in the risk analysis world. So these are structured analytic techniques, or SATs, and when Jay talks to you in just a moment, he's going to use that term. So remember that SAT is the government acronym for these types of techniques. The one that I mentioned in the article, and those of you who may have seen that article, it's been posted by Risk Minds as part of the library of specialty expertise in preparation for their upcoming conference. And this key assumptions check essentially is a diagnostic technique that provides a very disciplined process that really falls into several steps. And of course, I'm not going to go into them in detail, but you're talking about assembling a cross-disciplinary team and then defining what is the outcome of the situation that you're dealing with. Then focusing on 5 of the most critical assumptions that have to come true in order for your outcome to be successful. Then thoroughly test the evidence that supports these assumptions. Isolate any weaknesses in the assumptions that result from that test and that could jeopardize the outcome. And then, of course, share the findings of this analysis with the executives, as well as any remedies for the weaknesses that have been identified. So this is a very disciplined process in and of itself, and it's just one of the techniques that I'm going to talk about. But now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Jay, and he's going to walk you through another technique, but in his own words, because, of course, he has the familiarity with these techniques from his many years of service. All right, so I'm going to flip the slide, and I'm going to hand the mic over to you, Jay.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. It's good to be here, and I'm going to have Steve move the slides forward. I want to do a couple of things. I want to build on what Steve said and then talk about a specific type of SAT that we've used a lot in the intelligence world. First of all, as Steve said, we really do share worlds. We share worlds of high risk, uncertainty, demanding customers, oceans of data, heavy deadlines, and little margin for error. As Steve pointed out, the assessments, the difference is the stakes. The assessments feed into policy decisions every day that move people into conflict, that develop alternative, and to develop new policies. And developing alternatives is oftentimes a matter of life and death. And the other point I want to make here is consensus is not enough. Getting people around the table to agree to one path is not the answer we're looking for. The importance of SATs in our world are two. First of all, they force analysts. They're qualitative tools. In other words, they're based on discussions with people around the table. They force analysts to collaborate and to discuss possible alternatives based on evidence. It's a world that is not for the weak of heart or the thin-skinned. Some people have called it analysis almost a blood sport. But the SATs are very heavily mission-focused, and they're qualitative tools built on structured discussions. They're really about managing complexity. And they answer the question, how do you work with teams of intense, smart, hard-charging analysts with deep expertise, different views, sharp elbows, through discussions on really some of the world's most difficult problems? And SATs help you do that. We're going to focus on just one today. SATs, structural analytic techniques, have been mandated to be used in analysis since 9/11. There's a red cell that the CIA has established, and other organizations in intelligence we have them as well, that's intended completely to focus on contrarian techniques to challenge conventional thinking. Analysts are steeped in structural analytic techniques from the time they begin their training and their more advanced courses through their careers. So the SATs have the effect of changing the dynamic of the conversation. And as Steve found out in the poll, not every day is magical when you're making decisions. And SATs have the power to change the conversation from personalities and emotions to the data. Steve, if you hit the next slide, I'll talk about one more specifically. Okay. Steve? Okay, contrarian.
Okay, there you go, Jay. Yep.
Okay. I want to talk about contrarian techniques. These actually, Steve and I agree, fit well in your world where you have to do stress tests on your different systems. Basically, contrarian techniques focus on high impact, low probability outcomes that can seriously damage organizations. These map closely to the challenges you face in identifying systemic risks to your organizations. These are not random events. Okay, these extreme events are not something that you sort of guess are going to happen. They're real risks, specific risks to your business. They can be applied across any business at any level, regardless of the data, and regardless of the business that you're in. Important line, as Steve pointed out, okay, is that they don't replace your current process. They test the judgments and they help frame forecasting. So what I want to do now is talk about specifically the contrarian tool called What If. Steve, you get the next slide.
Here you go.
Steve? Okay.
There you go.
So I want to talk about the contrarian technique. And I want to talk about, okay, I'm sorry, Steve, can you switch to the case, I think?
Yep, I've got the case study up on the screen.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. No. All right, thank you. I want to talk about a case that brings home the importance of the value of these tools. It's a case I worked on for a publication I did for another client. And basically it talks about a company that was established by 4 MIT professors and called American Superconductor. And they developed an algorithm that moved power back and forth between windmills and the grid. They built a partnership with a Chinese company, and 70% of their business went to this company. And for a while, the relationship went very well. The workforce went from 80 to 900. The stock went up to $300 a share, and the market valuation was over $1 billion. What happened was that in March 2011, the Chinese company stopped accepting deliveries of the software. And there wasn't really sure what happened, but as news of the cutoff of the deliveries took place, circulated around the industry, the value of the share dropped immediately, almost 40% within a matter of 2 weeks. It dropped to $77 a share. Almost 40% of the valuation of the company dropped in 1 day, and the loss rose to 84% by September. The CEO tried to repair the damage, but Singapore refused to budge. In 2011, a repair crew was in China. They didn't really know what happened. They got into a windmill. They tried to look at the software. It turned out that the software was a pirated case, a pirated software that they had developed back in Massachusetts, and it was gone. And there was nothing they could do about it. So what had happened, looking at the triggering events, what we want to do here is talk about an extreme case, and this is really an extreme case of insider threat, intellectual property theft. And what you do with what if, right? And we'll go into more detail on the next slide. Is you determine what the extreme event is. In this case, it was the insider threat, and of course, which ruined the company. The stock is now selling at $3 a share, and they're down to 75 employees. And you walk back through the events that might have caused it. And just looking back at the information that we have available, you can take a look at just 5 of the things that they really didn't pay attention to. They didn't consider the crown jewels to be at risk. They didn't think the algorithm was at risk. They were blind to the Chinese partner's deceit. They had no one over there watching it. The algorithm was stolen. It was supposed to be a secure server in Europe. It was stolen by a Russian employee who had access to a trusted employee who had access to the computer, who stole the algorithm, was paid $20,000 for it. There was a lack of warning. The system left the theft undetected for months. You can tell that it was almost 4 months before the company even knew it had been stolen. And there was no background checks or termination strategy. They didn't really check into the background of these employees, and they really didn't have any way to exit these people in a way that was going to protect the company. So it caused tremendous risk. Steve, if you could hit the intelligence risk management techniques.
Yep, okay. We're on the slide there.
Okay.
Jay?
So what I want to do just briefly is sort of run this through this tool that we have. And what you begin with here is the key judgment. You begin with the judgment, and the judgment was of this company that they had secured the algorithm sufficiently, and that was the judgment. And in a what-if scenario, Steve or myself would come into the room and say, I want to test that. And so you begin walking back through different pieces of the system. So I've given you the triggering events, the things that they really didn't consider. And if you walk through the process, okay, you begin walking an argument of how it could come about. And you can identify one or more plausible paths. The diagram to the right shows that it's not just one path to catastrophe, there could be multiple. Okay? And you specify what concrete events would have to occur at each stage of the scenario. Now, I want to stop and talk about those for just a minute. Okay? The specific event, okay, is concrete. So, for example, if you go back and look at the previous slide, you'll see that one of the things they didn't do was they were blind to the Chinese partner's deceit. Okay? So they drill down and talk about how did that happen? What was it in our system? Okay, what was it in our thinking in our system that said it was okay to do that? And they drill down deeply. They didn't realize also that they really had anything of value that needed to be protected any more than it was. So they go back and they say, how did that happen? How did he get into the computer? How did this trusted employee get into the computer, and why didn't we vet him more carefully? You begin walking back through each one of these steps. The important thing about the concrete events is that it begins a process of drilling down into each one of those steps that could have gone wrong. For example, what was our hiring like? What was our vetting like? What kinds of systems did we have on the computer to protect it? Should we have had a partner in China working with Sinoval, with a Chinese company, every day in their space? And then after you do that, you verify that preventive controls are in place. Those are the remedies. Again, it's not a check-the-box exercise. You really have to go through and take a look at each event. Then you have to verify the preventive controls that are in place, and you have to test those. And another important step then is when you're done is to develop an early warning system, the last 2 ticks. You develop indicators. These are observables that would detect the scenario unfolding, and then you monitor the indicators. The point here is that listing is not enough. Each one is more work to determine the extent of the vulnerability and develop and execute mitigation strategies, and then to test them. These are deep dives, and you have to watch it. Okay? So I think we go back over to you. I think that takes us through it, the what-if scenario. Steve?
Thank you very much, Jay. And I know you could only just give a brief flyover of everything that was in the case study that you did. But I think one of the takeaways for our audience today, and one that I want to emphasize when I try to pull this together into why this can be powerful for the work that our audience today is doing in the financial sector, is that the various tools that are available, and the two that we talked about, just one diagnostic and one contrarian, these are forensic tools, and these tools drill right into the details. They question everything. They question assumptions and beliefs and biases and data and controls and so on. And that type of approach is not something that you activate lightly. So in situations which are especially important and where you have so many moving parts, as you call it, an ocean of data, if you don't have this kind of forensic approach, then you are seriously at risk of misinterpreting what are both the risks and the impact of those risks, and what is the likelihood that those risks will crystallize. So that is really why these techniques. Yes, go ahead, Jay.
The other real value of this, and I should have made the point even more forcefully, is that these are qualitative techniques, as Steve has pointed out, and they bring people from different parts of the organization around the table, and they bring a discussion to bear. Multiple perspectives can help solve the problem more quickly and more efficiently. Steve, thank you.
Yep, absolutely right. So it's like if everybody in the organization who can contribute to a successful analytical process that leads to a successful and valuable decision is brought to bear in a way that's collaborative, and as these techniques do that, then you get the best possible chance for these complicated situations where there is no certainty, only the quality of the process that can be applied to analyze them. You have the best possible chance of a successful outcome. So when Jay and I first got together, it's almost 2 years now that he introduced me to these techniques. Because of what I've observed in my career, working in banking and asset management and many different roles, I realized right away that I had not seen practices that were as rigorous as these ones employed in situations that were high stakes. And so I thought there's a clear opportunity for these types of practices to find a home in the financial sector. But also, it's not just about following these kinds of scripts, and Jay just gave you one version just in a sample exercise that he's worked on. Some things that really matter as far as are these techniques going to be successfully embedded into any organization is to be sure that there's a culture that accepts the possibility that these kinds of forensic approaches really can make a difference. And so I want to highlight here as we close that, first of all, these tools have to be recognized as being valuable and powerful. If you start with an audience that's skeptical, we want, obviously, people to be realistic and to test any kinds of tools and practices in a practical setting. But they have been validated in very high-stakes situations, so they have credibility. And this is not just going through the motions, as Jay said, not checking the box. So the credibility of these methods is established. Secondly, that inside an organization, the implementation of these methods can't just be done in a superficial manner. Basically, they have to be applied in the same rigorous manner that Jay is talking about, and that goes on every day in the government sector. And then lastly, like many risk management approaches, enterprise risk management itself is a framework that has to be given the support by the senior management in the company that's going to adopt them. It's just not possible to be able to bring these techniques to bear in a productive manner if you don't get senior management buy-in, and also that they should be invested in what this process produces and challenge it and question it, and so treat it with the rigor of interpretation that corresponds with the rigor in which this type of analysis is produced using these techniques. So I think at this point, I'm going to hand over one more quick poll question for you, and this really is going to tell us whether what we've said in this short webinar resonates with you. So thank you, Charlie. You've opened up the poll. Let's find out whether our audience has recognized something that resonates in their own world as a result of my, and then more importantly, Jay's descriptions. So as we're giving you a chance to answer this poll, and you don't have too many choices to make, what we'll do after the poll is closed is that I'm going to hand back to Ed, and hopefully there'll be some questions that you will have asked. So you've had a chance to put them in the chat panel, and then also we'll also try to answer any other questions that relate to the practices that are part of Jay's professional career, and for me, my effort to try to bring these into meaningful use in the financial sector. So let's look and see what the poll tells us. So we have at least a passing majority. 54% of you think that these could definitely improve your organization's performance, and that's probably a good crossover to those of you that answered the first poll, saying that your organization makes efforts in this direction but can do better. And some of you probably, that smaller percentage that are quite satisfied with the way your organization handles these. You don't need us to tell you what to do, what you're already doing well. And quite reasonably, there's at least almost 40% of you that don't know. And I think that's only fair. This is only a short overview of these techniques. And I think if you are going to determine for yourself if they can be useful, you definitely want to get more information about them than you can possibly get in this short webinar. All right. At this point, I'm going to hand the mic back over to Ed, and Jay and I will happily answer questions and try to fill out any additional information that we can provide in the remaining time.
Great stuff. Thanks very much, Steve, and thanks very much to Jay as well for a really insightful presentation there. Yeah, let's jump into some questions. I have got one here for you, and I'll read that out now. So the example that you've given provides a good walkthrough of a post-crisis deep dive. How would these techniques work in a forward-looking situation?
That's a good question. I'll take that, Steve. Basically, what you have to do is Basically, what you have to do is to begin to take a look at your organization and see where your vulnerabilities are. In other words, the first thing you have to do is begin to say, what can happen? What can go wrong? If your judgment is that your systems are safe, okay, how do you know that? And then you go back and you say, okay, somebody stole our trading algorithms. We had an insider trader incident. My systems went down and our redundancy didn't work. All the different things that can really do damage to your business, you begin to think about those, and then you start looking back and see where am I really vulnerable? What are the what ifs, the extreme events that can really put my business at risk? And you start going back in the drill. So it is an important tool for inoculating yourself from some extreme events, and it gets you used to thinking about handling those things as well.
And just as you were talking, Jay, what I was thinking was, there's a practical application that's going to something that many of the audience that work in risk management have to deal with, and that is that under current regulatory requirements, reverse stress tests are part of the panorama that have to be done in terms of forecasting, not just what might happen in a downturn, but working backwards from something that would essentially bankrupt the entity. So when putting together a reverse stress test, this is one of the most challenging types of analysis that can be some of the audience could potentially be involved in, because that's where biases come into play. So, for example, if you're trying to be objective about a scenario that leads to your own demise, that's very hard to do because most employees and skilled professionals like yourselves, you have survival bias. Right? In your heart, you believe that your organization is immune from the kind of event that you're being asked to describe. And you can't really give the task to an outsider because they don't really know the business anywhere near as well as you do. So you're kind of caught in an in-between space where you have biases and others have objectivity, but you have the knowledge and they don't. Now, if you use the kind of contrarian type SATs that Jay's talked about, that can help you to distance yourself from the biases. You can use a what if, something dramatic would happen that could completely sink your business. You can also look at high impact and low probability, so that might be a chain of events where one thing leads to another. But these types of techniques and the rigor and the very structured way in which they're applied can allow the in-house team to overcome their survival bias. And of course, as Jade mentioned, it brings credibility to the scenario, right? You can defend the scenario by saying that we have walked through what are the actual actions, the steps that would result in this hypothetical reverse stress test. So hope that answers the question that you got from your audience member.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. We do have time for more questions, so I would encourage people to continue to ask questions in the next few minutes. So another question as well, could you please describe in more detail how contrarian SATs can be used for reverse stress testing?
Yeah. So going on what I just said, reverse stress testing isn't exactly the manual for that really hasn't been written because every organization is unique and independent. So there's only a coherent and rigorous process that can be common across financial institutions. And because that process, broadly speaking, as we kind of identified from the polls, doesn't really exist. Every organization has its own approach, some good, some so-so, and some not so good. The tools that Jay is familiar with and has been using during his career, they provide a process that can get that activity into a well-defined manner. So, I mean, reverse stress test is one of the tasks that require managing this kind of complexity that Jay was describing. But it's not the only one. There are many other complex situations in financial institutions that do need this kind of rigorous process, but where the process itself typically is underdeveloped and so therefore has not been as tested in practice anywhere near as rigorously as these techniques that Jay's bringing have been tested in practice. So reverse stress testing is kind of a good example, but certainly not the only one that financial institutions are going to have where these techniques can be useful.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And then I guess segueing into another point, can you describe maybe how contrarian SATs have been used for cyber risk management in a bit more
How about you, Jay?
detail?
I'll take that one.
Yes, that's another good question, and they're used again to test systems. There's a difference between what happened to the company in Massachusetts. That was an insider threat. Someone had access to the computer. Cyber threats are different, of course, and these are done from outside. External actors penetrate your system. It's a complex problem, and it's hard to answer in such a short time. But again, from inside, if you want to test your systems and actually test accesses and test personnel, how you hire and train, how you train your workforce to be watchful. There are lots of things you can do to alert your workforce. But in terms of testing the systems, that's really more for the professionals to answer. But in terms of how the SATs can test some of the other vulnerabilities, some of the ones that are externalities to actually the hardware, certainly contrarian SATs can do that as well. You can see one of the things I mentioned with the Massachusetts company was the hiring. How well are these people vetted? And also firing. Most of the insider threats, a lot of the damage to the systems come when people are given notice between that time and the time they leave. So there's lots of things they can do externally to apply those systems to test some of the accesses and the other tools they have to protect their systems. Steve, anything else?
Yeah, so I was going to ask you, Jay. I mean, we understand that the techniques you describe have been adopted by the CIA in a compulsory manner since 9/11. Are there any other agencies that you know that are working on cybersecurity that are using these techniques?
Almost all of them. I think that any of the intelligence, in terms of intelligence, in terms of cyber techniques, and from an intelligence perspective, all of them are using these. All of them use these to sort through the complex problems they're dealing with. Of course, I can't go into any of them. But we've had people in the classes I teach where they talk about how they've used SATs to work out differences of understandings of how systems work and where the vulnerabilities are. And that goes on all the time. And that goes on throughout the intelligence community. The National Security Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency, the FBI, all have extensive cyber threat teams that do that. There's one in the public that actually provides very good guidance for that. It's the CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team at Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, has a website that talks a lot about that as well.
Great. Well, I just mentioned that one, I think, because this is an area where I think probably our audience feels somewhat uneasy, just because the technical skills involved in cyber security typically aren't in everybody's background. But the fact is that the processes to make sure that the defenses are safe, they correspond to risk management processes that are much more familiar. The question is maybe what's lacking to make those processes more robust is the kind of approaches that are being used in these government arenas when they're looking into and verifying and doing this forensic work to make sure that the preventions from cyber attack genuinely are there and work. So hopefully that our audience will be thinking, good possible application for these tools in the financial institution world. Any more questions there? Sorry, go ahead, Jay.
Just one more point. It would certainly mean a different set of actors around the table than you might have if you're just doing something financial. It might be that the financial people are part of a larger group that takes a look at the system's risk.
Yep, that makes sense.
Okay.
Any more questions, Ed?
Yeah, I think we've got to wrap up. We've got one final one. I think this kind of nicely ties things together, and you might embellish a little bit on some of the things you've talked about. You might bring some other points in. But the question is, do intelligence risk management techniques deliver any other benefits besides those described in today's webinar?
Hey, Jay, over to you. Okay.
I'll take that. Yeah, I guess I'd just like to hammer home some of the points that have come up during the discussion today. First of all, they enhance collaboration. They create an environment that leverages diverse views and expertise. You can bring people from all over the company, all over the organization together in multiple disciplinary cross-component decisions. Oftentimes we have rooms full of people that agree with each other, don't have the right skill sets. And the other thing too is everyone brings their own equities to the table. Everyone brings their own institutional interest, their own division interest, and it allows them in a structured discussion to bring these all out. Number two, and Steve and I have mentioned this several times, it helps check biases. The SATs can help test all sorts of decisions. They can test intuition as well. We'll go with gut decisions. Well, test the gut decisions. And the other powerful thing about SATs is they slow you down. We have a tendency to jump right away to the answer. And it's not always the right answer, and it's not always the thoughtful one, and oftentimes doesn't bring in all the equities and sort of what-ifs involved in the decision. And these things just sort of slow you down. And the other thing that Steve raised is that it strengthens credibility. You can walk people through the results. If you have a client and they ask for a risk assessment, you can use some of these tools to walk them through and say, we've considered this. It makes conversations much more transparent. The other thing to keep in mind is that the CIA and other organizations use facilitators to make sure that the discussions go well. So basically then they enhance collaboration, they check biases, they strengthen credibility, and again they're qualitative. The answer is in the room, and the SATs help bring that answer out in a way that brings rigor and discipline and make sure everyone's equities are considered.
All right,
okay.
Ed, I think, Jay, I think you wrapped it up really well. I couldn't have said it better.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, that's all we've got time for, unfortunately. But thanks again to Jay and to Steve for a really insightful talk. And again, thanks to everyone who tuned in this afternoon to listen. It was a recorded webinar, so if you've got colleagues or peers who you think would have enjoyed that, they can listen back to that on demand. And if you really enjoyed it, you can listen to it again yourselves as well. If you've got any feedback generally about today's webinar or any future recommendations, do complete our short survey at the end, which will flash up on your screen shortly. We are offering a little prize at the end of this webinar for sticking with us, and the event, the Risk Minds International Conference, takes place in a few weeks' time, December 4th to 8th in Amsterdam. We're offering an exclusive discount for all audience members of this webinar. So there's a 10% discount on a pass to the event. That should flash up on your screen as well currently. If not, it should do in a short while. We'll also email this to you as well, so that you've got that to hand to register. So yeah, you've got all of that. Finally, if there is any ideas for webinars or general feedback, you can visit our Risk Minds community page, where you'll find sort of other recordings of webinars, articles, and interviews with global industry experts. So thanks again to everyone who joined, and see you all again soon.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.